And that's because Becker said self-esteem is an anxiety buffer. We demonstrated that that's the case. We brought people into the lab and threatened them with electrical shocks. And after we momentarily elevated their self-esteem by giving them fake feedback on a IQ test, it was remarkable. Just having your self-esteem momentarily enhanced reduced physiological arousal in anticipation of an actual physical threat. In other words, self-esteem is pretty potent stuff. However, there's a downside to using self-esteem in order to manage existential anxieties. And the downside is that the way that we get self-esteem is by adhering to the dominant values of our culture. And we live in a culture that, I don't mind annoying people, in America, we're essentially narcissistic sociopaths who are only concerned about being the best at whatever it is that we do. And so to have enhanced self-esteem in America in the 21st century requires almost that we inflate ourselves to ridiculous proportions while looking down on those who we need to see as inferior to us.
What role does the awareness of death play in existential and social life? That is the key theme of this conversation. Sheldon Solomon is a social psychologist at Skidmore College, one of the developers of terror management theory, and has dedicated a significant portion of his life to understanding death and the role that it plays in our lives. Here, we talk about social psychology, psychiatry, a bit about positive psychology, terror management theory, existential philosophy, and some related social and political issues. If you like the podcast and want to support the work, consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. That really helps us out. Here is my conversation with Sheldon Solomon. Yeah, so maybe the best place to start off is, how did you get interested into Becker's work?
Well, to be silly and honest, quite by accident. I was a young professor at Skidmore College, and I came here in the fall of 1980, and I was asked to teach a class in personality theory, which I knew very little about. And I was actually I was in the library trying to find the bookshelves with Freud's books. And I passed by a few books that caught my eye. And literally it was because one of them had little green spots on the cover, and that turned out to be a paperback version of Ernest Becker's book, The Birth and Death of Meaning. And I just found that to be an interesting title, and I yanked the book off the library shelf. And in the first paragraph, Ernest Becker wrote that he was interested in trying to delineate the motivational underpinnings of human behavior, but he didn't say it in such a turgid way. He said, I want to understand why people do what they do when they do it. And I was like, this is so refreshing. Me too. And then right next to that book was the book, The Denial of Death. And Becker, I never met him. He was dead in 1980. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1973, I believe, and was the only one to ever win a Pulitzer Prize and not be alive to receive it. But in the first paragraph of his book, The Denial of Death, he writes that in his estimation, it is the uniquely human awareness of death, along with our disinclination to accept the reality of the human condition, that underlies a substantial proportion of human activity. And I was like, at that point, I was really taken, because that was congruent with my own personal experience. And so this brought me back 20 years earlier, when I was 8 years old, the day that my grandmother died. And I realized later that day that I too would someday die. And so for me, this has been a very personal as well as a professional journey. I've been disinclined to die since as long as I can remember. And I found Becker's ideas about the pervasive effect that the awareness of death and our resistance to it has on almost everything that people do. I have found that to be quite compelling.
Right. It's strange how Becker really does have all this important things to say about sort of the conceptual foundations of psychology, but his work isn't included amongst the people who tend to inform psychology and how it develops later on.
Yes, that's right. Fair enough. He was, in our opinion, one of the most important and least regarded the thinkers of the 20th century. He had a very difficult time getting and keeping jobs, in part because he insisted on interdisciplinary inquiry back in the day when that wasn't all that popular. And moreover, he managed to annoy everybody. So he was a cultural anthropologist using ideas from psychoanalysis and existential philosophy in order to make bold claims about human behavior at a time when psychological discourse was moving away from these kinds of grand theories in favor of more microscopically focused efforts to understand particular phenomenon in a rigorously empirical way. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that in our estimation, what that did was to preclude serious consideration of Becker's ideas, for half a century.
That's a very good point that prior to sort of that era of theory, there wasn't really a strict division between what we would today call psychology and today call sociology. But later that splintered off in a big, big way.
Yes, I think that's right. And so to the extent that we, my buddies and I, Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski and I, were graduate students together at the University of Kansas in the 1970s. In 1980 and 1981, when I became aware of Becker's books, Tom and Jeff read them. We agreed that this was interesting, engaging, and provocative. Um, we went to speak at lots of conferences, and our colleagues hated it. We could clear a room of famous psychologists in minutes. Um, our efforts to just publish papers describing Becker's ideas were routinely rejected for the better part of a decade until an editor said to us, and rightfully, he's like, look, these ideas are fascinating, but you will never be taken seriously in academic psychology in the absence of empirical evidence. And then to be silly and annoying, he was like, and you are experimental psychologists, so why don't you give it a go? And that's essentially what we've been doing for the last 40 years, is to take Becker's ideas and to frame them in ways that allow us to generate hypotheses that could then be subjected to empirical scrutiny. And so that's, yeah, at the risk of sounding a bit narcissistically inflated, I think if there's one thing that we have done that's worthy of a footnote someplace, is that we have, over the decades, created a large enough body of empirical work such that there's now a discipline in psychology called experimental existential psychology. And there are a bundle of studies that we believe provides convergent support for Becker's claims about the extensive role of death in life. And moreover, not everybody agrees with us. There's vigorous disagreement about these ideas. And while this may sound counterintuitive, for us, the best indication that a set of ideas is being taken seriously in scientific discourse is when other people take the time to be critical of it. And so we see this as important. We think there's a lot of evidence for what we call terror management theory. We think it has not yet been proven wrong. Other people from a variety of vantage points have alternative ways of viewing these phenomenon. And just for folks that are listening that might take that as an indication of problems, in fact, it's quite the contrary. Science goes nowhere if everybody agrees, and science goes nowhere if you're the only one that's dabbling in a particular set of problems. So I'm ranting a bit, but I do think there's a lot of evidence for these ideas. I think that they're beginning to be disseminated beyond experimental social psychology. And most importantly, if Jeff and Tom and I were to keel over today, I don't think that the work would stop, which is, again, the best indication that something substantial has transpired, is that other folks are engaged independent of our efforts.
No, that's a very good point. Of course, because this is in the early days, it will take a long time before people agree on everything. But for so long, existential philosophy was kind of in its own corner, where you were either participated in it or scoffed at it from the outside. But the fact that there is healthy exchange and the fact that there is this dialogue between experimental methods and existential philosophy is a huge step up from the past.
Yes. And moreover, just to continue that for a moment, what I think is also exciting is the increasing connection right now between our what we just consider to be basic research to corroborate, or rather to assess the merits of Becker's ideas. Now there's clinicians intersecting with this research in a dialectically productive way. In other words, we see clinicians using our research to design accessible interventions, and we have now become more poignantly and profoundly aware that there's a lot of people out in the clinical world that are dabbling in existential approaches to therapy, whether they would describe it that way or not. And so we've become more attentive to what therapists are doing out in the so-called real world. They're paying more attention to our work, which suggests that death anxiety is a prevailing concern in all psychological disorders. And I think this bodes well, perhaps, for therapeutic interventions that have yet to be designed, because without sounding too doomsday, I think the world right now is completely saturated with death anxiety. And I think the degree of psychological apprehension, I call it dis-ease, put a hyphen between dis and ease. I think that it is overwhelmed the mental health care system. I mean, I'm not the only one to say this, but usually it's in the context of the pandemic, that crippled the healthcare system. I think it's more than that. I think it's the incoming climate apocalypse combined with the pandemic, combined with the increasing political polarization and racism. And frankly, in my country, we're on the cusp of fascism. I think all of those things are contributing to just massive doses of conscious and unconscious death anxiety, to the point where it's beyond conventional psychotherapy. This is more, and no disrespect to CBT, but there is no protocolized manual for tweaking one's cognitions to render you psychologically secure in the midst of an existential crisis. And I'm hopeful that some of the projects I'm working on right now may sound naive, but their efforts that think about how do we develop scalable therapeutic interventions that might be able to be administered by folks in the community to large groups of people. And so I'm hoping that there may be some immediate value to what we're doing. Yeah, in the wake of this particular historical moment, when I think existential concerns are maximally salient, both consciously and not.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, it's insane that we don't talk about depression, just to take a point and example, as the epidemic that it is. It affects such a vast amount of people in such serious, crippling ways that yeah, I mean, it's remarkable that we don't face
Yes.
that head on. Let me ask you this. So there's this idea that psychiatry will expand to deal with these new sorts of methods. But then there's this other counterintuitive idea that psychiatry might be inherently limited in the ways that it can that it can produce interventions, because it's inherently designed to deal with dysfunctions in the way that we narrowly define them. Then perhaps we might need other forms of whatever we want to call them, but things that will take the place of that intervention. Positive psychology is an idea that comes in. So what do you think about that? Do you imagine that psychiatry will internally expand?
That is a fine question. I have to be honest. At first, I was skeptical of positive psychology, and now here I am, 20 years later. Honestly, both empirically and personally and conceptually, drifting in that direction. So back to the original query, which is psychiatry intrinsically limited? And I think my provisional response is, yeah, to a degree, because psychiatry was derived from a medical model, which does tend to, as a default assumption, see everything as a direct manifestation of neuroanatomical or biochemical activity. And therefore, the first impulse vis-a-vis intervention will tend to be pharmacological. And this is not always the case. I know of quite a few psychiatrists that are just as devoted to other kinds of interventions, but the kind of standard approach to psychiatry is still pretty much anchored to a medical model. And so I think that's one limitation. Another possibility, so Otto Rank, who was one of Freud's disciples in the Denial of Death, Becker quotes Rank, and I'm going to botch it, but Rank said something like, psychology is a preponderantly negative and disintegrating ideology. And so here's Otto Rank, a great therapist, and I think this is in his book Beyond Psychology, where he's like, I've spent 40 years thinking about living. Now I'm just going to live. But Rank's point is that psychiatry, as well as clinical psychology, is ultimately, I don't know I was going to say flawed, but how about limited? Because the way that Rank put it and the way that Becker describes it, you go in and you see a psychiatrist or you see a psychologist. They do some psychological archaeology and come up with an explanation of why you are dissatisfied with yourself, and then they essentially leave you with no way then to do much with that. In other words, they're like, here you are, you're a non-optimal self. I can explain to you, perhaps, the nature of your misery or even the history of its origin, but that in no way offers any insights about what to do thereafter. And so that's just, and even Freud at one point said, psychoanalysis can cure you of the misery of neurosis so you can come face to face with the misery of life. Oh, that was uplifting. And so that's another possible way of seeing psychiatry as being a bit limited. And then what I would say, my preoccupation these days, well, there's two other things. One is that, and here's where I'm influenced very much by on the floor in the building that I'm in. The psych department's on the first floor, and I got moved up because we didn't have enough offices. But I hang out now amongst the historians and the social workers, and what they have pointed out, and what I was aware of, but not sufficiently, is just the extent to which really big institutional structures have, an extraordinarily potent effect on psychological matters. And psychiatry, in an effort to appear objective, masquerades as apolitical, ahistorical, having nothing to do with social structures. And my point is, you're being political when you say you're apolitical. You're being historical when you say that you're ahistorical. And to me, I think that's another important consideration that we need to ponder. My first little academic rant was titled "Why America Causes Mental Illness." I don't know why it didn't go over that well, but but my point is that I don't think we are psychodynamically sufficiently aware of how institutions impact our interior mental lives, and we could do better on that. But then back to the positive psychology folks who, following Aristotle, have argued, again, at first I thought they were just kind of, Woodstock like hippies, overly naive and positive. And many of those folks are, but this is not the time to engage at that level. I mean, I was invited to the first positive psychology conference by Martin Seligman and Chicks Make Me High, the Flow dude. And then I was never invited again because they're like, you're a downer. Stop talking about death. This is positive psychology. But the point, though, is that, Aristotle, he was adamant that, to live a good life, they call it flourishing these days, is more than just the absence of negative symptoms. And what the positive psychologists have done now empirically is to demonstrate that fact, and that that well-being is more than just the absence of symptoms. I think the way that most folks think about flourishing these days, and it really does map on to Aristotle's, he's sitting on a rock 3,000 years ago with a chunk of feta cheese, and he's thinking about stuff that today strikes me as quite accurate. He's like, well, a flourishing individual has a sense of meaning and purpose, has a sense of self-efficacy, has a sense of moral virtue. Aristotle also talked about practical wisdom and talked about the fact that it's impossible to flourish as an isolated individual in the absence of social relationships characterized by trust and respect. And so I think that there's lots of directions that psychiatry and clinical psychology can be moving in, and the good news is that they are. And so I'm working with some awesome folks, and we just did a study looking at a big data set, like 80,000 individuals, and it was looking at the relationship between a flourishing measure and suicidal ideology and behavior and self-harm. And sure enough, what we found, was that there was a strong negative correlation between flourishing and suicidal behavior, ideology, and self-harm. In other words, the higher the self-reported flourishing, the lower were all these negative outcomes. And that was after controlling for all of the negative symptoms like depression and loneliness. And so I would say on empirical grounds that we now know that there's something to strive for above and beyond the eradication of particular symptoms. Well, but that we also know, and you've probably seen this, the amazing research with psychedelics. I'm like an ancient hippie, so it's easy to dismiss my view as one too many Grateful Dead shows in my youth. But the point is that the hippie days set us back 50 years, because before the 1960s, there was a massive literature from Europe suggesting that under certain conditions that experiences with psychedelics could have the same effect as long-term meditation, actually has the same effect as near-death experiences without having to nearly die. And I think this all bodes well. I think we're at a moment where, in part, I think, as a result of empirical work in existential domains, it just doesn't sound quite as maniacally speculative, but to think in these terms, that there are a variety of ways to infuse our lives with meaning and value, and in so doing, allow us to manage death anxiety in a fashion that doesn't necessarily have deleterious consequences. And I think that's a fine goal aspirationally.
Absolutely. It's very tricky to talk about because you're always fearful that people might take these things dogmatically, right? That you mentioned psychedelics. Well, there are instances where you actually do need traditional psychiatry and pharmacology. And there are
Absolutely.
instances where you do need to stay away from psychedelics. So
Absolutely.
I'm always fearful that people are listening to the nuances of these.
Yes, so absolutely. So let's say this again, because this is none of these statements, or actually to back up, like in psychobabble, the point is whenever we make a declarative statement like, oh, psychedelics have been shown to be beneficial, the immediate question should be for whom and under what conditions. And I think you make a fine point. And our view these days is, trying to be pragmatic and eclectic. Psychedelics for one person, it might be meditation for another. It might be telling stories. There's a great literature now about how extraordinarily palliative and uplifting it is to just being asked to tell one's life story in the company of somebody who is interested in listening. And yeah, I think right now, to get back to an earlier point, where there is a degree of psychological need that is such that it would be silly to confine our inquiry to a single approach and assume that it's going to work for all folks at all times. It's a great point.
Do you think clinical approaches psychiatry inherently function on a dysfunction model, in that in order to apply psychotherapy or psychiatry, you need to imagine that there's something wrong with the person, some sort of damage in them, and then the reason I ask this, where I'm going with this is, well, if we're to take Becker's claim seriously, that death anxiety isn't something wrong. It isn't some sort of anatomical or physiological damage in the person. It is inherently a part of what it means to be human. Then does that pose a problem for a dysfunction model of psychiatry?
Yeah, I think it poses a challenge to take a closer look. This is awesome. I wish I was young. I mean, I'm being silly because what I say now is, um, well, what I say is that if you're just starting college now, and if you want to do this work, you need 3 PhDs. You got to have cognitive neuroscience. You got to have another one in kind of philosophy, broadly defined as back in the old days when psychology, sociology, philosophy were more unified. Yeah, and then you need a PhD in like statistics and methods for the 21st century. And the reason I'm mentioning all these things is that I'm seeing work now all over the world. There's some scholars in Asia, and this is to my discredit. I've reviewed papers, and I don't know necessarily the author's name. There's some other work from Israeli researchers, and they're looking at the effects of death reminders on literally individual neurons at this point. And they are claiming to be at the point of having a neurological model of what happens as we begin to come to terms with death. Because the goal is not to eliminate death anxiety. That's not possible, nor would it be desirable. That's my silly joke. If you were a baby, and your mom and dad were out at a concert and they forgot about you for a couple of days and you were not worried about anything, well, you would be dead. In other words, we need anxiety, or at least a bit of it, to be alive. And so when Albert Camus says, come to terms with death, thereafter, anything is possible. Well, the one thing he's not saying is possible is that death anxiety will be obliterated. Rather, what we can hope for is that it's not constantly buried under the psychological bushes, where it comes back allegorically to bear bitter fruit. It just ultimately comes down to what happens when we stop repressing death anxiety. And yes, at that point, where I see the neuroscientists and the psychiatrists going, it is we think that there are ways of looking at what happens as people are coming to terms with death. And that allows for the expansion, I think, of psychiatric discourse to go beyond the mitigation of dysfunction, as opposed to the alteration of basic processes to render them such that psychodynamically and emotionally and intuitively we are more comfortable with the reality of the human condition.
Right, absolutely. Confrontation is a tough question.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
if living forever was an attractive option, then we would have solved the problem. Then everyone would just want to live forever, and you wouldn't have a problem. But that's not an attractive option either.
Exactly right. That's right.
Right, right. So what are there any generalities, commonalities that you find in people who are coming to terms with death?
Wow. Okay. So awesome question. And so here we are. I got to go back and admit that I cavalierly shrugged off what the positive psych folks were doing, and it turns out that their work is now converging with ours. What I mean by that more particularly is that for decades, following Ernest Becker, our remedy for death anxiety was to boost self-esteem. And that's because Becker said self-esteem is an anxiety buffer. we demonstrated that that's the case. We brought people into the lab and threatened them with electrical shocks. And after we momentarily elevated their self-esteem by like giving them fake feedback on a IQ test, it was remarkable. Just having your self-esteem momentarily enhanced reduced physiological arousal in anticipation of an actual physical threat. In other words, self-esteem is pretty potent stuff. However, there's a downside to using self-esteem in order to manage existential anxieties. And the downside is that the way that we get self-esteem is by adhering to the dominant values of our culture. And we live in a culture that, so I don't mind annoying people, in America, we're essentially narcissistic sociopaths who are only concerned about being the best at whatever it is that we do. And so to have enhanced self-esteem in America in the 21st century requires almost that we inflate ourselves to ridiculous proportions while looking down on those who we need to see as inferior to us. Right? What the positive psychologists have done, and this should for some that reek in the positive sense of some Eastern thought, it aligns well with like Buddhist practice as I understand it, but positive psychologists, they talk about kind of a tripod of existentially uplifting phenomenon. They talk about it in terms of awe and humility and gratitude. And they're like, hey, Kierkegaard said that if you're smart enough to know that you're here, because we're conscious, he's like, that's awesome as well as dreadful. And of course, we spent 40 years on the dreadful side of things, right? You're going to die. You can get hit by a comet. You're a breathing piece of meat. But we didn't attend adequately to how awesome it is to be alive because you know that you're here. And so basically what the positive psychologists have established is that when we have this sense of awe, when we just wake up one day and are like, life is great, that has a collateral effect, and that's to make us humble, right? And I always have to define this to Americans because they see humility as a pejorative descriptor because they equate it with self-deprecation, which it's not, right? Humility is just realizing accurately your position in the universe, which is literally quite infinitesimal and inconsequential. If you think about it, you're born in a time, not of your choosing, in a place that you don't dictate, in a body that you didn't get to select. You're here for a tiny amount of time, and then you're summarily obliterated, which seems demoralizing. But the point is that, but it's not demoralizing because even if you are a tiny little speck, you are still connected to everything and everyone. Moreover, you can't say that you're not going to do something in your life that isn't massively important or transformational. I may not be Einstein, but I may be walking to work earlier today and I just passed somebody on the street. We just look at each other and kind of like say hello. And what do I know? Maybe that person was walking to a bridge to jump off and kill themselves, but because we had that momentary connection, they don't. Well, maybe that's the next Jesus or Buddha. And unknown to me, I actually contributed to the salvation of Earth. So anyway, the point is that to be humble is to just recognize that our appropriate place in the world as it is scaled, and that in turn, the positive psychologists say, makes us grateful. And we're grateful for being alive. We're grateful, I say to anyone who will listen to me, I'm like, look, if you slept in a bed last night, if you had lunch today, you should be effusively grateful. And that's before we look at the news and gape in horror at what happened yesterday in Turkey, what's happening every day in the Ukraine, or fill in the blank. And so the point is, and here's the big point, and that is that we know empirically that awe and humility and gratitude are, they all effectively mitigate death anxiety. So when we remind people that they're going to die, in our studies, they do a lot of things. That they like people who share their beliefs, but they hate people who are different, and they're more likely to vote for fascist leaders. They're more likely to spend tons of money on stupid stuff that they don't need. So to me, they're more likely to deny that humans are animals. They're more uncomfortable with their bodies. Those are all maladaptive responses to death anxiety, but that there's a much more uplifting, benign, if not benevolent alternative, and that's to go in the more holistically and positively existential direction of awe and humility and gratitude. And for the moment, I'm kind of preoccupied with that, because if there's one thing that we can cling to, for me at least, in the current world, it's just to be delighted each day to find myself awakening and to be in a position where my life is, for the most part, more than anything that I could ever have hoped for.
Absolutely. Reckoning with this will be a central thing for humanity moving forward. To me, one of the most salient parts of Becker is when he asks us to evaluate if the values in society the espouses are the ones that it allows you to attain.
That's correct. And that, honestly, that was, for me, 40 years ago, that's what got my attention. I was already being silly. My first paper was, and talk was, why does America cause mental illness? And my response, and this was I started this the week after I read Becker for the first time, and it's because we adhere to cultural values that are not realistically attainable by the average individual. And that's what I see happening right now all around us, because we live in a world where we're told if you're not an idiot and if you try hard, you can be just as rich as like Bill Gates or Elon Musk. And if you're not, it's your fault. And that's just, frankly, nonsense. There is no economic mobility in the United States. It's easier to get out of poverty in Bangladesh. And moreover, again, silliness aside, we're a culture that denigrates old age. So even if you're getting old in America, that's a bad thing. And if you're a woman, and if I can't floss my teeth with you, you're too fat. And if you're older than your mid-20s, you're too old. And again, I'm being a little silly, but it turns out that this is a recipe for psychological despair. We teach our kids to really desperately yearn for the goals and values that are simply unattainable. And here's where I like Becker's point, where he's not over-romanticizing the past, except to note that when you look at Christianity in the Middle Ages, where people were told that in principle, everybody's eligible for immortality. Doesn't matter if you're rich or not. Doesn't matter if you're the Pope or the president or a dipstick for a cesspool. If you just behave with integrity, God will shine his countenance upon you. And I really do forcefully advocate for Becker's ideas, which is we need cultural values that are realistically attainable. And without sounding silly, there was a time where it was okay to be average in America. There was a time where just being decent and responsible was held in the highest regard. And yeah, I'm back to Nietzsche when he's like, hey, we have to reevaluate all values and recognize that there are some that would be timely and important to abandon at this point.
Right, absolutely. I mean, even given the calamity of the past, it really does feel like we're coming to a pretty dangerous precipice in human history.
That's right.
Given climate, income inequality, the rise of fascism and war, it seems like a pretty dangerous crossroads.
Yeah.
And it also does feel like economic and political solutions are what we need to focus on because they seem like the practical way to maneuver the future. But it does seem like it's so down to the core of what human behavior is that we need a large-scale reorientation of how human psychology works to be able to seriously address these challenges.
I think so, honestly. And yeah, I do. I think that's profound. And I don't know if it makes sense to get into this, but that's what I see right now in the U.S. with all of the arguing about being woke, and is really basically, I've already said I think America is drifting in a fascist direction, and I think that politicians who I would characterize as fascistic are going to enormous lengths to prevent people from stepping back and trying to see more holistically the relationship between cultural values and individual well-being. The fact of the matter is that I don't think we'll be able to foster global well-being without a radical alteration in our economic system. So this, again, these are people of goodwill could disagree, but you have Steven Pinker, smarter than me at Harvard, writing books about how the free market is great. Let's just do more of the same. And I'm like, that's crazy. That's like you're on a boat, headed towards Niagara Falls, and you think everything's great, but you don't know that you're just about to tumble over the abyss. I see, and this may, I don't mean to be cynical, but I do see most of what we value, the way that we teach people to behave, is really an implicit way of maintaining a particular form of economic organization. Really, to me, it all goes back to John Locke. Americans were not very literate, but I always say to my conservative friends, you need to read John Locke to understand why you're saying the stuff that you now are, because Locke's point was, in a state of nature, there's no societies. There's just autonomous individuals pursuing their self-interest, and that we reluctantly enter civil society in order to protect our property, essentially. And Locke then went on and he said, well, there's no private property in nature, but surely you own your body, and surely you have a right to exist. And so, if there's an apple tree 100 yards away and I walk over and pick an apple, well, the act of picking it, my labor, turns common into private. And Locke goes on and he's like, I'm entitled to as many apples as I want, as long as I don't waste them or rob anybody else's apples. And then he's like, well, okay, but once there was money, apples rot, but money doesn't. Now I can have as much money as I want. And then he says, well, people vary in industry. Some are smarter, some are lazier. And so it's just natural that there's going to be inequality. And Locke is like, yay for inequality. It's natural and it's good for humanity because the rising tide lifts all boats. My point is that there's no evidence for any of that. These are some of the most obviously wrong ideas in the history of Earth. And yet they serve as the basis for the values that we teach our kids. Be competitive, be focused on your own personal pursuit of profit. That in the long run will benefit everyone around you. And I can't even remember how we drifted in this direction, except that I'm back to the point, which is that, yeah, for me, we're going to have to take a hard look at the world to get ourselves out of what I think is just an interesting dynamic. Max Weber, the dead German sociologist, in the book on the Protestant work ethic, he talked about how we're in this funky situation. He's like, yeah, in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, it benefited everybody. But then he's like, somehow we got imprisoned in our own prosperity, that now we're born into a world that's just a mechanical process of buying and selling, and that we're on this increasingly frenetic hamster wheel of life. And the most eerie line in that entire book is when Weber says, and I suspect that this will keep going until the last lump of fossilized coal has been burnt. And every time I read that, I'm like, that is exactly what's happening. We're incinerating Earth. The Shell, the oil company, made like $36 billion in the last quarter. And here we are again in my country, probably about to elect people to public office to promote that view, but which is not only suicidal for the planet, but it's suicidal for the psychological well-being of the people who live within this system. Michael Sandel, Harvard professor, wrote a book, The Tyranny of Merit, where he's like, look, we have to understand what's happening. When you live in a world like America, where it only counts if you're the best, well, think about the implications. That means N-1 people in every category are losers. And he's like, no wonder why Americans are either depressed or enraged. We've set up a system that makes most of us abject failures. And I do think we're going to have to tweak that.
The average person has to be average.
Exactly. There you go.
It doesn't make sense any other way.
That's right.
No, it's tricky because, I mean, going back to political theory, Hobbes and Locke, state of nature, social contract theory, for a number of years it became kind of kosher to make fun of that from a psychological perspective, because psychologists discovered altruism and sociality as a centrality, and we thought, okay, the old Hobbesian conception of self-interested actors as a basis for organizing political systems was wrong. But there's something to it. It keeps coming back, and if you take a look at how society is organized today, it's hard to prove Hobbes wrong completely.
That's exactly right. And I really enjoyed speaking with you today, because that's my take on things. It's unfortunate to view things on a continuum where if we go one way, it means we're moving away from the other. And the way you just put it is magnificent. There is ample evidence, starting with Darwin, that we are at our best uber social, hyper cooperative, extraordinarily altruistic to the point of heroic, at least to members of our tribe. On the other hand, that in no way, in my estimation, along with just watching the news every day, that does not obliterate, unless this is a Mary Poppins film, the darker side of human behavior, which we also see manifested every day. That's right.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's tricky on the solution end of it too, because I mean, like I see great psychologists either interfacing with economists or political scientists and then working on policy solutions or stuff like that, or they're making these larger sort of philosophical existential claims. And you want to support the policy side because that seems actionable, that seems practical, and it can achieve something realistic in our lifetimes. But then again, you take a real look at the state of politics today, and you think, well, really, I mean, are these just empty gestures that we're making, and we really are doomed completely? And then do we actually need a broader solution? But then that seems unattractive because it seems so grandiose and unattainable that one becomes lost and conceptually confused as to what to do.
Yeah. No, again, excellent point. And here I'm stuck quoting from Joseph Henrich. He's the head of the anthropology department at Harvard. He wrote a book on cultural evolution. And, I love it at the end where he just says, humans are pretty crappy at designing interventions. And and he doesn't say this cynically. He's just like, it's a plea for humility and the capacity to consider multiple approaches. And this also strikes me as an important stipulation moving forward politically, economically, and psychologically. I do think that in the West, we have this linear view of progress, which, is limiting in two ways. One is it assumes things will always get better. And, just the notion of a line suggests that there's one path to get to where we're hoping to be. Yeah, and I think those are misguided assumptions that are.
And Nietzsche makes that point. I mean, there's lots of problems with Nietzsche, but he makes the point that if you commit yourself to a view of never-ending progress, then you will always be beholden or lesser to a future version of yourself. And that puts you into a space of existential dread.
Yeah, no, I love that. No, again, I'm getting old because Nietzsche, as a youth, was exciting, and then I'm like, oh, what a lunatic. And now I read him, and I'm like, yeah, okay, but he was florid at times, and yet, just amazing. And one of my favorite thoughts along those lines is when Nietzsche says something like, we always see people as courageous when they vigorously defend their ideas. And he's like, that doesn't take any courage. The real courage is to stand back from your ideas and to subject them to the same critical scrutiny that you would if somebody else was articulating them. And I find that awesome and something to aspire towards. Our mentor in graduate school was a great scientist. And if we went into his office and said, Jack, we have an idea, let me tell you why it's right, he would be like, shut up, tell me why you might be wrong. And again, I think that the kind of critical skepticism of the Nietzsches of the world, which should not be confused with the kind of hopeless nihilism of a Dostoevsky character in a Russian novel, I think that's something that would be very important to reinvigorate the sciences as well as clinical approaches.
Now, that's a very important practice. I had a TA once who told me a story that just stuck with me forever. But she went to art school, and they worked on a project where they had to create a sculpture. And there was like a term project. They worked on it for months. And at the end of it, the instructor revealed the second part of the assignment, which was they had to destroy it. And they had to find an interesting way of destroying it. And that just blew me crazy. I'm like, that's so interesting. To be able to devote yourself to something like that, but then also to bring yourself to destroy it in an interesting way.
Ooh, I love that. And that's my understanding of like the sand paintings of Native Americans, that just these magnificent I find it the same. It takes my breath away because um, and I do think I find it the ultimate testament to humanity is to be able to appreciate something and for it then to be destroyed, for lack of a better word, because now the value of whatever it is that you do is not predicated on its extended existence over time. And to me, that's one way of disentangling the beauty of anything from the death denying elements that necessitate that it has to be there and remain in its original form.
I mean, especially in academia, it's always fleeting. I mean, the most brilliant work that we do today in 30, 40 years time will be just common sense to an undergraduate. In 50 years, it'll be like common sense to a high schooler, right? So why get so attached with it? Just let it flow by.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that is really awesome. And that's what I try to remind myself of every day. My joke, I'm going to be 70 next year. I'll retire in a couple of years, even though it's like awesome. I can't believe they still pay me to like read books and have these kinds of conversations. But, it's nice when someone says, "Oh, I've read your book and let's talk and blah, blah, blah." And I was like, yeah, that's awesome. But the fact of the matter is that whenever I retire, I'll be forgotten by the time I get to the parking lot. And that's how it should be.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, so you mentioned Nietzsche. We're talking about Nietzsche, Heidegger can't be far behind. Have you started paying attention to?
So just belatedly. So Nietzsche was in my youth and then had to come back. Heidegger, I just 3 or 4 years ago got to for the first time, and now I'm on Levinas.
What have you found anything interesting in Heidegger?
I have. I like um the. I'm not a philosopher, so I can't evaluate the merits of the philosophical argument. I'm more captivated by the second chunk of being and time, which a lot of philosophers don't like. And they don't like it because, well, again, not to get into a disciplinary pissing match, they don't like it because it's psychological. To me, that's where Heidegger lays out his idea about what happens to us in response to angst, which, he's, it's anxiety with a sense of uncanniness, just he describes it as you feel unsettled or kind of homeless. And, he traces that to death anxiety. And then he's like, okay, what happens? And for him, it can go in one of two directions. He calls it a flight from death. He says, most of us, all of us from time to time, in response to death anxiety, whether we're aware of it or not, we just fervently embrace the social roles that we inhabit in the context of our culture, and in so doing, become culturally constructed meat puppets who are tranquilized by the trivial. He got that phrase from Kierkegaard. So Heidegger, to me, is a secular Kierkegaard. He's saying that's one way, and that's most of us do that from time to time. And some Americans do that all the time. They're in their house spraying Cheese Whiz on a cracker, drinking a 30-pack of cheap beer before they hop in their SUV to buy a machine gun at a lemon at Walmart because it's $1 cheaper. And so again, they're just but it is so frenetically devoted to their day-to-day activities, but they're actually caricatures of stereotypes of social roles. That Heidegger calls that inauthentic. But he is quick to stipulate we are all inauthentic from time to time. And I like his language when he says that when you're doing that, you are fleeing from death and you're falling away from what he calls your own self, because that's not you. All right. But then he says it doesn't have to be that way. You can respond to anxiety. And here he's using Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard said, look, anxiety both repels and attracts. And so the repelling part is when we flee and become, culturally constructed meat puppets. On the other hand, I love when Heidegger says something along the lines of anxiety is also yourself summoning yourself to become itself. And that at our best, this gives us, and it doesn't have to be conscious. He calls it a moment of vision, but it doesn't need to be a minute and it doesn't need to be conscious. He's just like, okay, sometimes death anxiety gives us clarity. It opens up a mental horizon where I see that I'm a culturally constructed artifact. I'm Sheldon Solomon, born in New York. I'm a psychology professor. Yeah, fine, but I could have been born, I'm stuck on, I could have been born in the 3rd century in Mongolia as a goat herder or even a goat. And the point is that when I recognize my essentially historically contingent, ultimately arbitrary nature, for a moment at least, all of the cultural symbolism that I basically use to define myself and by which I live every day has been momentarily obliterated. And while that could make me tumble into the existential abyss, it can also give me a renewed sense of meaning and purpose. So Heidegger talks about coming to terms with mortality, and then he describes somebody who has done that, and he says that these are folks, he characterizes them as in terms of anticipatory resoluteness. So he says these are people looking forward, and whatever they're doing, I had to look up resolute because I grew up in America. It means to persist with admirable determination. And then he says, we will also have solicitous regard for other people and other things. Heidegger's often accused of being too individualistic and not adequately social. No, that's not true. He says an authentic individual cares not only about other people, but other things. And then he's like, when we have those experiences, our life appears to us to be an ongoing adventure perfused with unshakable joy. And when I read that, I'm like, yo, dude, that's like awesome. And again, he's not a simpleton. None of this is to suggest that obliterates anxiety or suffering, but rather it gives us a stance towards life that enable us to appreciate the best aspects of life, but while accepting the inevitable anxiety and suffering that arises as a consequence of being human, and in so doing renders us capable of managing it more maturely and effectively. And yeah, so I think Heidegger I like his depiction of that process. And I think a lot of folks in the century that has followed have borrowed from it without knowing, myself included, that that's what we're doing.
Right, absolutely. No, I think there's a great similarity between Becker and Heidegger in that.
Me too. And this would be the question I would ask him if I ever had the privilege of talking directly is, why did you end up so preoccupied with Kierkegaard, which of course that's fine, but without mentioning Heidegger as historically derivative and a secular alternative. What a lot of people struggle with Kierkegaard, myself included, is his adamant claim that the leap of faith necessary to become authentic must be literally faith in not only a God, but the Christian God. And yeah, so anyway, I do wonder why Becker ended up preoccupied with Kierkegaard.
Maybe maybe it's just historical contingency and kind of the danger of reading Heidegger in the. I mean, there's this sort of exclusive version of Heidegger and this inclusive version of Heidegger, or this liberatory view of Heidegger, and then this Nazi view of Heidegger, and that might confuse. Or
Well, luckily, I've been able to dodge that by virtue of my ignorance of all of these things. I ignored him for 40 years because he was a Nazi, and there's no doubt, in my opinion, that he was. And that makes the work, to me, even more interesting. But in some ways, he is showing, to borrow from Nietzsche, that he, too, is all too human. Even more interesting to me as I've been getting better acquainted with Hannah Arendt. I love her book on the origin of totalitarianism, and then to realize that, she was romantically involved with Heidegger. So here she is, a Jewish student of Heidegger's, involved with him, and still defended him after World War II. And it just shows how interesting people are. Yeah. Yeah, but that's so if I got to talk to Heidegger, I would ask him if he ever thought about what he's saying about the flight from death in light of his own political predilections. Which is just another way of saying what I do to the Skidmore students is like, well, if you want to figure out why somebody's miserable, you can usually do that in like 5 or 6 weeks. I can teach you. But if you want to figure out why you're miserable, you need to look in a mirror. That'll take 5 or 6 years.
no, I mean, there's debates amongst historians, and they're important. But at some point, we need to recognize that any thinker from the past will come with baggage, and the real meat of the work is just what we can take away from it, and not what they meant by it.
That's correct.
Yeah, so are you, just sort of to end off here, are you hopeful for the future of term management theory?
I don't care much about the future of term management theory. I'm hoping I'm not deluding myself when I say that we were trained to be scientists. I love reading Ben Franklin's autobiography because Franklin says, hey, I did these studies. Some people say I'm right. Some people say I'm wrong. But the studies aren't going to go away. And if I'm right, that's fine. If I'm wrong, that's fine, as long as we figure it out and go in a different direction. What I say about terror management theory is I don't think we're wrong yet. I think that and I think that the theory is still producing interesting hypotheses that, when tested, so far have produced results that are sufficiently consistent with the theory, but that it doesn't require either abandoning it or revising it to the point where it has little to do with the original formulation. Yeah, but if that happens, I think that's fine. Again, I wish I was a little younger. A term management theory, is basically going on 50 years old. I think it needs to be updated in light of Becker's writing, I think our understanding of evolution. So I was referring to Henrik's work on cultural evolution. In term management theory, we talk about cultural worldviews as if their sole function is to deny death. When Henrik points out that cultural worldviews contain the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of thousands of years. And we need to, as terror management theorists, integrate that view of culture with the way that we have framed terror management theory. Similarly, I've been recently trying to get a better handle on the developmental process. We don't come into the world aware of death, but we are at some point. And I think that the work on theory of mind and on, or what do they call it, shared attention, I think all of that is really important. So if I had a decade to just lay out, I would want to try and write just one more take at, all right, what term management theory, let's say in the 21st century. But no, my hope is that Jeff and Tom and I will be jars of formaldehyde in front of some building someplace, and that people will continue to pursue existential questions without uh, being, without being imprisoned by our particular theoretical take. I find it delightful to see these ideas wafting into other disciplines, and that gives me hope. And yeah, beyond that, and I know I'm maybe sounding silly and maybe overly naive, these kinds of ventures give me hope. What Ernest Becker wrote in the 1970s, he's like, there's a lot of truth out there, and we're almost choking on truth. And he, in the denial of death, he said, we got to synthesize the truths and condense them into, nuggets of wisdom that in his last book, Escape from Evil, he's like, and then we need to broadly disseminate these notions.